So what I want to do is give an overview of the rehabilitation program. That's kind of a dynamic process. It's things have got rolling over the last couple of years, but they're starting to build. Erica showed these two documents, the management strategy and the action plan. These were written in 2007 as a result from the 2006 in-flight. And at that time, rehabilitation was part of the plan. It was listed, just that some of these areas will be managed for other values. And at the time, we thought maybe this might come into play, and but now it is. So I just want to take you just through some of the impacts of the beetle so far. This is a map from 2007. This is our management zones after the in-flight in 2006. That color right there is the holding zone, and there was some action in all of that. This is the zones in 2013. This is all inactive holding, all of that green. So you can see our priorities for control have changed based on the amount of attack in there, and especially after the 2009 in-flight. 2009 in-flight was even heavier than the 2006. So it changed our management, our treatment zones greatly. And Jim talked about that with moving away from that. Jim Stevenson talked about this, that a lot of these areas up in here we haven't tackled there since 2007. So they've been slightly growing, but for various reasons we decided not to tackle them. But they have been sitting there, and there's quite a high level of mortality in a lot of those stands. Erica talked about this, and this has been talked about a lot. We spent a lot of money so far. So level 2 numbers. Just so far there's been 16 million cubic meters of level 2 harvest. Take this number with a grain of salt, because that's varying levels of attack. That could be 1% attack in those stands, but we call them level 2 if they cross the scales as a beetle block. So take that with a grain of salt. But that was been talked about before. What level 2 harvest is controlling the beetles through harvesting. And there's been 1,100 openings or cut blocks that have had some level of beetle in them. This is what was in our databases last week. So long-term timber supply. So the healthy pine strategy has been talked about. That's the surge where we wanted companies to reduce the amount of susceptible pine by 75% over the next 20-year period. This is meant to alter the age class of the pine, so make it more resilient to fire, insects and that type. But this comes at a cost. And this was talked about. Darren talked about this a little bit. This is just a planning unit that say has 100,000 cubic meters. That's the status quo. To reach that 75% reduction in 20 years, you have to boost your harvest greatly, up over 300,000 cubic meters annually, to meet that, and then you're going to drop down below that status quo. So that's the fall down that Darren was talking about. A lot of the companies couldn't reach the 75%. There's too much pine in the landscape. Some of the strategies were 58%, 60%, that kind of thing, but most companies could not meet the 75%. So this is just a background to some of the impacts, and just that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the remaining pine resource, as far as timber supply and the other values that it produces. So since those 06 and 09 in-flights, you've seen a diminished ability for the companies to salvage. The shelf life problems that Jim talked about, that you're looking at maybe up to 5 years for shelf life, that's pushing a lot of these stands in uneconomic situations. And you couple that with inaccessibility or far cycle times, and it drops your economic harvest greatly. So we're having this inventory build, and as those stands kind of grow and we're not controlling them, you're seeing that inventory grow somewhat. And that precipitated the need for the rehab program. And this has been talked about. Darren talked about this as well. Starting in 2011, we started with the seed collection program. That was about $1 million went into seed collection. One of the messages we got from BC was don't forget about the seed. They were short of seed in a lot of areas, because they didn't, I mean, obviously you get this massive influx of beetles and a very rapid increase in beetle populations, you're going to get seed problems. So a lot of the pine was taken out before they could do a lot of the collections. So we took that to heart and started that collection process pretty soon. June 12th, as Darren said, $40 million was set aside for emergency mountain pine beetle. 10 million of it was earmarked for rehab, and that was specifically in that funding was to reforest areas where trees have been killed by infestations in previous years. So, and I think this picture has been kicked around. I thought that was a Mike Maximchuk picture, but I think Jim had the same one. So some of the components of the program. So guiding principles. These have been drafted by worked on by Ken Greenway and Lee Martin, and as well as delivery principles, policy development, which is an ongoing thing, stand selection criteria. That's that attempt to be strategic, and treatment strategies. And all of these are ongoing. This is a very dynamic process. As you heard today, all the information coming in about what stands are doing, trajectory of stands, all those kind of things. That leads to this very dynamic need. So some of the guiding principles for the program. So rehab will be used in forests to mitigate risk to ecosystem goods and services. So especially where you have multiple critical values at risk. We must be very strategic in what we do. We're going to have a whole range of treatment options. You're going to have intensive, extensive. You're going to do nothing. Perhaps many of the time, a lot of the time, you're going to be doing nothing. We have to be cognizant of that. A key thing as well is to build that scientific foundation through research, through technical expertise that we have on staff and external to staff. We have to be able to evaluate effectiveness, and we have to monitor everything we do. It's very important that we monitor for future outbreaks is for one thing, and to know that we're meeting our objectives. So some of the key program delivery principles. It's provincial in scope. It's not. We have to think of the whole province, the whole affected area in our program, not just specific areas. This has been talked about, but stands eligible must be netted out of the operating land base, and not part of the regular forest management planning and reforestation process, for the reasons that have already been talked about. Rehab strategies will depend on the specific risk, and I'll talk about that some more. But we just before the break there, we discussed that it depends on what you're after. What value you're trying to protect, that'll change your strategy greatly. Must be collaborative with stakeholders. We have industry doing a lot of this work, and we have to work with them to do a lot of this stuff. I mean, they're the first ones out of the gate here, so there's going to be a lot of learnings from this. Another key program delivery is FRIA will administer the program, and Jim talked about what the FRIA guidelines and objectives were. And that came from government to FRIA, and that was without us having everything in place. That was a good way to get the ball rolling. Is to engage FRIA, get those objectives out there, and get some work on the landscape. This is my only somewhat gratuitous fish picture. It is a value at risk. The other ones are not so gratuitous, but. So another key principle is we can't do it all, and nor should we. And we talked about this a lot about this earlier. We've got a relatively small budget, $5 million this year and $10 million last year. It sounds like a lot of money, but you really cannot do a whole lot of work with that. So we've got to be smart. We can't just throw money at it. We need bang for the buck. So we're really looking for those areas that have multiple values at risk. And one thing that we're doing is we may do restoration, but we're not always going to do restoration. And rehab is not restoration. Rehab is ensuring ecosystem function is maintained. Restoration is getting exactly what you had in the landscape beforehand. And we're not always going to do that. And likely we shouldn't. So time heals. So most forests, as we've seen, will naturally regenerate to certain levels. And sometimes that's exactly adequate. Other times it's not quick enough. We have all kinds of impacts on the land. There's lots of pressures from different industries, everything else. And if that key piece of mountain pine beetle impacted land is the straw that broke the camel's back, that might lead it into needing rehabilitation prior to that period of time where you're going to get fully stocking again. So sometimes it's going to be quick enough, sometimes not. And that goes to my next point, that if you have key ecosystem services that are at risk, you may have to step in and do something. We have certain zones of high biodiversity, key fish and wildlife habitat, all kinds of things, water yield, as well as public safety and wildfire risk. So you may need intervention, and the key to this is we know multiple uses of key importance to Alberta, be it midterm timber supply, bioenergy, all those kind of things. So those are all key things that we have to keep in mind. Other things, these are just things that we have to consider with what we do. Policy, department vision and goals is an important one. We have to make sure that we follow that. And Darren talked about that with land use planning and those kind of things. We have to make sure that what we do falls into those plans. There's operating ground rules, softwood lumber agreement. We talked about that, and as well as midterm timber supply is clearly another thing to consider. In an attempt to be strategic, this is something that I think needs to be done, and it's been started so far. Is a stand selection criteria, so a decision support system. And so how do we choose stands for rehab? And it's not so easy as saying everywhere or nowhere, or it all depends on what you have. And there's all kinds of work, and I've got Poach BC, and I think there's a lot to learn from BC. The ecosystems aren't quite the same, but there is still lots to learn from them. So I'm sure I'll be bugging Dave quite a bit. And lit reviews is something else. We have a lot of research going on a lot of fronts, but have they been brought together? And they haven't really been. So again, the program is provincial in scope, and sometimes industry's priorities aren't going to intersect with our own, and we have to be cognizant of that. Sometimes there's going to be things that we would like to get rehab that industry might not want to. There could be involvement with other partners like the ACA, those kind of things, as far as accessing free dollars. If there's key certain things that we want to have done, so there's other options as well. I think inventory is our number one need. We've got some photos, photography done, 40 centimeter, 50 centimeter resolution, but I think we need a lot. We need to get a good inventory of what's actually killed out there. We've done some work on looking at old photos and growing it forward using green to reds to try to estimate how much mortality we have in the landscape. But it's probably a good idea to have a good baseline of what's actually out there. And that would feed into any kind of decision support system very well. So I think that's very, very necessary. And I think with this decision support tool, you can get all kinds of values and try to look at something strategic. Try to look over the province as a whole and try to pinpoint those areas that really need it. You can overlay multiple values and try to assess some values on some priorities to different areas of the province. Rather than just being one-off and doing one project here, one project there. I think it's important that we look at things strategic. But keeping in mind what Dave was talking about, that before you make a decision to actually do something, you got to get on the ground and make sure it's worth doing. Looking at something through GIS is always different than looking at it on the ground. So these are some of the things that we would look at for a stand selection criteria. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have mortality, which is a key one. And whether that's done through an ABI call, if you have a recent ABI, or if it's through some inventory work that we might do, it's very important. Crown closure, that understory characteristics, that could be a struggle because we know ABI is perhaps not the best at understory inventories. But some of the other ecosystem service things, you know, we have known wildlife and biodiversity zones. We have known Class A watersheds. We have all these values that we know are on the landscape that might tell us to start putting some of our rehab work into those. It'll help focus what we're doing. Another thing is I think that might be an option as well, is just rare natural subregions. If we have pretty underrepresented or small representation of certain natural subregions in the province and ecosites, that might be something, because of their endemic biodiversity, those kind of things, that might be a priority for some rehab. And there's also some safety issues. You have roads where trees might fall on roads. You have trees might fall on power lines, those kind of things. So there's things that are important there as well. Not a gratuitous picture. It's a west slope cutthroat. So ecosystem function values are very hard to pin down. I mean, how do you assess a lot of these things? Quantifying biodiversity, nutrient cycling, those kind of things. And I think there needs to be a lot more investigation into that. I mean, you could use more of a coarse filter, like just knowing that you have a known inventory, Class A water bodies, that kind of thing, and using that to assess your priorities. But there's probably some better tools as well, some better ways of assessing, you know, your different ecosystem, you know, functions and ecosystem services that would help you kind of guide you strategically. That's an Athabasca rainbow. So back to the rehab prescriptions. I'm not gonna stand here and say this is, you know, we're going to plant 1,500 stems per hectare. We're going to plant 500. We don't know yet, because you don't know what values you have to protect, and it's. If you know what value you're trying to protect, if it's some key species, the habitat of some key species, you're gonna gear you're gonna set your objective on that, and you're gonna gear your prescription towards that. So it's, without knowing what you're up against, it's hard to define a prescription. I'm just thinking if critical Athabasca rainbow trout habitat, if it's heavily impacted by mountain pine beetle, you're probably going to want shade in there. If you don't think the trajectory of that riparian area is going to lead towards quick recovery of shade, those kind of things, maybe you'll step in and do some kind of prescription. It wouldn't be a timber prescription. It would be getting the shade back on and getting the temperatures regulated in the stream. So there's different prescriptions based on what you want to do. Again, it's like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Caribou habitat, I've heard some people say that you leave it. It's providing arboreal lichen. I've heard others say you got to take it down and get that stand growing again. So it's going to provide long-term caribou habitat and not just short-term habitat. So it's not settled. So there's still some questions that we need to figure out. And if we're actioning these sites, maybe you have to prescribe a mosaic of things. Maybe you want some new forest growing. Maybe you want to leave some and just leave it standing. With federal caribou recovery, it might force us into leaving a lot more. Who knows? I'm just guessing. If logging is considered disturbance, then maybe that'll force our hand. Who knows? And just so some of the things, depending on what value you're looking at, maybe shrub planting is more appropriate than trees. It all depends on what you're doing. And again, when do you plant 500 stems per hectare? When do you plant 1,500? You got to look at the trajectory of the stem that you have, see where you think it's going to go. Is it going to meet the needs of the value you're worried about? If it will, maybe you do nothing. Maybe you walk away. If it's not, then you fill plant, those kind of things. There's a lot to learn from a lot of the work that's going on, and I'm sure there's going to be a heck of a lot more work coming up to investigate a lot of these things. That FGYA trial that Sharon Meredith talked about yesterday with the series of permanent sample plots, I think is a really key one. Just to find out what happens in those stands. There's all kinds of things. There's increment. There's release in those stands. There's vegetation. What happens? There's all kinds of things we can learn. And it sounds like the Beyond Beetle project is a similar vein to that, and the Camphor work as well. There's a lot of learnings to do. So this is just further research work needed. This is just some throw up things here. It's a lot of this is probably being looked at right now. I don't know. I'm not up to date on all of the research done so far, and I'm getting up to speed, but I'm not there yet. So there's probably a lot of this that's already been looked at. But I know silviculture practices, under planning, mechanical site prep, where Canfor will be looking at that. There's Vic is doing some of that stuff. So that work's ongoing. Measuring ecological function, like I said before, it's pretty hard to pinpoint a value and measure some of that ecosystem function that we may need to do. And yeah, so this is Darren talked about this as well. The aerial seeding program, or the aerial seeding work that they did last summer. So this wildfire was in 2012. It was heavily impacted by mountain pine beetle, and 140 hectares of intensely burned. And that's the important thing, because I mean, we know fires, pine-like fire for getting trees back in the landscape. But this site was very, very intensely burned. The thought was that there wasn't a lot of in-source for there wasn't a lot of seed source, and the cones in the ground it was pretty well scorched. So they did a mixture of pine and spruce, white spruce, and flew it on the snow. So they dropped the seed on the snow. As the snow melted, the seed became on the ground, and that was what, March 30th or something, right before end of fiscal. And they looked at it last summer, and they found some germinants, and I think it'll be another revisit this summer, just to see how that did work. So one of the other things I want to discuss is this is a mountain pine beetle thing, but the provincial program is going to be looking at other things as well. Maybe, spruce beetle, we don't want it, but maybe it might come. That would also fall into the rehabilitation program. You have also white pine blister rust, hitting 2 endangered species, white bark and limber, which is also important, and spruce bloodworm. I mean, we haven't seen widespread death here. I mean, Eastern Canada, we've seen it in certain parts of the Northeast, but it hasn't really hit. But who knows what's going to happen? And so, just to summarize, the intent of the rehab program, we want to collaborate with stakeholders and internal content experts. We want to be strategic with what we do. We want those good candidate stands that we know that will mitigate some of the risk to ecosystem services. We want to do the work based on sound science, and hopefully what comes out of that will be some good outcomes for meeting multiple use values.